Welcome to week 8 of your sports psychology course. Today's topic is self-confidence and self-talk. Now, these are probably terms you've heard quite a bit about, and I'm hoping that today some of the learning that you'll gain is potentially challenging some beliefs you had about these topics, particularly with self-confidence, as there is sometimes an inflated sense of importance around self-confidence in sport and the impacts that it has on performance. I want to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all joining this lecture from today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The overview of today is that we're going to really be talking about two distinct topics, so self-talk and confidence. However, there is some interplay between them, and we will be referencing that throughout, particularly when looking at self-talk and how it can influence confidence. So we will start off today's lecture by covering a bit more of a background on the particular approach of cognitive behaviour therapy. And so throughout the lecture so far, I've talked quite a bit about the difference between more of a direct approach and more of an indirect approach. And I've talked quite a bit about mindfulness being the more indirect approach. So I thought it might be helpful for you all if I just went into a little bit more detail about this more direct approach of cognitive behaviour therapy. Because this is the traditional approach that a lot of traditional sports psychologists will have used for self-talk and self-confidence. And today I'm going to be presenting how you can apply strategies around self-talk and confidence from both a more traditional direct approach, as well as how it can be used for more of a mindful indirect approach. So cognitive behaviour therapy is an evidence-based therapy. It's one of the most commonly used approaches in the mental health field, and it has also been used a lot, specifically traditionally in sports psychology, as the field has been growing. So the basic premise of this approach is that our thoughts, so what we think, affects how we feel and then how we act. And if you can see on the right here with the diagram, each of the thoughts, feelings and behaviours, they all interact with each other. So how we feel can also influence how we think, and how we behave can also influence how we feel and what we think. So the idea is that they all influence each other. A simple example of this is if an athlete thinks, if I miss this penalty kick, I'm a failure and the team will hate me. Then they will feel extreme anxiety, panic, fear of judgment, and their muscles will tense up. Then they will hesitate, they might play too conservatively, or even choke or avoid taking risks. Whereas if an athlete has the thought of, I've practiced this 1,000 times, focus on the process, not the outcome, then they're going to feel calm, focused, their anxiety might lower, and that is more likely to result in them acting confidently, having increased focus, and being able to perform well. So hopefully you get the idea of this, and it can go both ways. So how they behave can influence how they feel and what they then might think. And so particularly if we're thinking about self-talk and self-confidence and how we would understand the theory behind it from these approaches, the common understanding is that self-talk, so our thoughts, influence how we feel. And so confidence, which I'll go into a little bit more later on, is an emotion. And so by the basic premise of self-talk and confidence, you could think of it as what you say to yourself and what you then think influences how you feel. So what you say to yourself before a performance influences how you feel, whether or not you feel confident. Now, this is, as I mentioned, more of a direct approach. So when you're using CBT, you can be more directly involved in challenging those unhelpful thoughts or beliefs and changing them to influence emotions and behaviours. So if you're having a lot of negative self-talk, such as calling yourself a failure and thinking that you're not going to be successful, an example here might be to notice or catch the negative self-talk and then reframe it. And then talk to yourself in more of a motivational self-talk way, such as, I know you can do this, or come on, you've got this. And so that's more of a direct approach to dealing with that negative self-talk. By saying things like, yes, I can do this, or you've got this, the idea is that these thoughts will lead to a different emotional outcome or behavior, right? So these kinds of thoughts will lead to feeling more confident as opposed to feeling a lack of confidence when coming into the performance. Now, there is a lot of research on CBT working in the mental health field as well as in the sport field, but I'm going to explore a little bit further in the research section about which components of this approach have merit and which ones maybe are not as direct. So the basic premise that it's always going to work, well, the research doesn't necessarily support that. However, there is evidence for motivational or instructional self-talk influencing emotional states. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about this in the research, but whenever I'm talking about more of a direct approach, I want you to think of this CBT model. So how we think influences how we feel, and then what we do and the relationships are all reciprocal. So this is the direct model I'm referring to, and this thoughts, feelings, and actions all have reciprocal relationships. This model is basically saying that by directly intervening in one of these aspects, it's going to have an influence on each of the other aspects as well. So when it comes to understanding self-talk, if we think about it as a broad concept, it's really our internal dialogue. But you can also say things out loud. And it's basically whenever you are the sender of the message and you are also the intended receiver. So just thinking about self-talk, it's not always in your control, right? So there are going to be some negative self-talk that comes up. And so self-talk as a general component or as a general theory is really just that internal dialogue or other words we say out loud to ourselves. And then we can exert control over what we maybe choose to say to ourselves. And there could be some negative self-talk that we didn't necessarily choose to say to ourselves, but it's still there. So there's a few different types of self-talk. I've really focused in here on motivational and instructional self-talk, as these are the ones that have more focus within the research. But I might also refer to positive or negative self-talk, which are, I think, quite self-explanatory. Positive in nature versus negative in nature. But if we were thinking about these two key types of self-talk in the literature, we have motivational and instructional. So motivational self-talk is a form of cues aimed at psyching you up or maximizing effort and building confidence or creating positive moods. So a great example of this is Lleyton Hewitt, the tennis player. He would have really motivational self-talk where he would often say things like, "Come on," in a very motivational way to really pump him up during a performance. And another example might be, "I can do it." So you're really talking yourself up. So when we're thinking about motivational self-talk, as you can see with those examples, they're not necessarily directing your attention onto a specific task-related cue. They're more impacting the emotional reaction. So trying to build that self-confidence and motivation or increasing that effort towards the performance. Alternatively, instructional self-talk is more of a focus and direct attention to a technique or a strategy. So some of these typical cues that we have talked about throughout the course so far, like if you're in a basketball free throw, for example, maybe high elbow is your cue. Or for swimming, length is a really common one for that technique or cue. So it's really about getting that focus on the task at hand, and as we'll talk about in a moment, the research suggests, depending on the type of activity you're doing, will influence whether motivational or instructional may be more relevant. So in a meta-analysis conducted in 2011, there were some key pieces of findings that I think are really important to take note of. So overall, self-talk just in general was shown to have a moderate positive effect on performance. So that suggests that the intervention of using self-talk does have a positive impact on performance. So if you're thinking about whether you should use this intervention, well, yeah. If you're using this intervention, the research suggests that it can positively impact performance and at that moderate level. Now, depending on the task, self-talk has a different impact. So based on the findings of the meta-analysis, self-talk overall was more effective for fine motor tasks. So when we say fine motor tasks, we're thinking about parts that require quite a bit of like the hand-eye coordination and quite a bit of attention onto that task. So we've got some of those examples like dart throwing or putting in golf or shooting in a basketball game. So self-talk is more effective for those kinds of tasks compared to the gross motor tasks. So thinking about any kind of activity that is more of a gross motor rather than a fine motor skill that involves more hand-eye coordination. So some examples of gross motor skills are cycling, shot put, and long distance running. Now the findings also suggest that instructional self-talk is more effective for fine motor tasks than motivational self-talk. So thinking about overall in the theory of why self-talk might be useful, we're looking at dedicating our attention onto task-related cues. And so for some of those fine motor tasks, where it really helps to have your attention onto something specific, it then makes sense that self-talk is more effective at those tasks, as opposed to something like cycling, where you maybe don't need to actually be thinking about the technique the whole time, and it's more around the gross motor skills. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as to the understanding of why self-talk actually does work, and this other aspect where self-talk is more effective for novel compared to well-learned tasks. So here it's really looking at the fact that for performers who are maybe learning a new skill, self-talk is more effective than for maybe someone who is an elite athlete who has that skill quite well down pat. Now this slide, is quite wordy, but it does really summarize a lot of the key information in the research around where self-talk actually is useful and what type of things it's used for. So one of the things I mentioned at the start of the lecture was I hope that you maybe gain a different perspective on self-talk and confidence than what you came into the lecture with. Well, this first point actually surprised me. So the current available data suggests that negative self-talk may not have a detrimental effect on motor skill performance. And one of the pieces of understanding around this is that potentially for some people, negative self-talk can be perceived by them as more motivational in nature. So someone might, really use that frustration and put more effort in. So based on the research in this meta-analysis, there's not strong data to suggest that negative self-talk has a detrimental effect on performance. But unfortunately, with the self-talk literature, there is still more research that needs to be done. And I would suggest taking this point with a grain of salt, because I would suggest that if someone is very caught up in their negative self-talk and really buying into it and believing it, it's more likely that it's going to distract them away from the performance, and then that could probably impact their ability to perform. Whereas someone who is maybe quite mindful in their approach, and they might notice that, there's negative self-talk there, but they don't buy into it, and they don't let it control their actions, rather they let it motivate them, then it's less likely to have an impact on performance. But unfortunately, I don't think that the research is at the point where it kind of has differentiated between the two types of how people might respond to that negative self-talk. So just suggesting here that I guess it really does provide support for more of that mindful approach because of this fact that just having that negative self-talk in general is not necessarily going to negatively impact your performance. It's how you actually respond to that and your relationship to those thoughts. That's what actually matters. So it's not just really bad if someone ever has the negative self-talk, But also, if someone is constantly buying into that self-talk and believing it to be true, and it's influencing their actions, then you know that something needs to be done. And you could use it for more of a direct approach or more of an indirect approach, depending on your modality. So this next point here, gains from self-talk are higher for task novelty, so is useful in skill acquisition. So that's kind of the point I mentioned earlier. Self-talk has been shown to be more beneficial or to have a bigger impact when the task is novel. So the way that they've understood that is when doing a novel task, self-talk could be often used for people kind of talking themselves through how to actually do the task, which is just not necessary for someone who is at that elite level and that where that task is more automatic. The way that the researchers have understood the relationship between self-talk and performance, and this is consistent with some of the previous lectures we've looked at, is that self-talk and that really increased focus and direct attention onto what matters. So what's important and that's really going to differ depending on the sport and the athlete. So for some athletes, maybe that more of instructional self-talk might be really important. Whereas for other athletes, those gross motor tasks, it could be more of that motivational aspect that increases effort. But it's really the understanding of self-talk is that you can help people shift their attention onto what matters in the moment rather than getting distracted on things that are not necessarily helpful for performance. Now, there is some evidence that self-talk is beneficial in improving cognitive anxiety, but it hasn't been linked to an improvement in somatic anxiety. So cognitive is anxious thoughts, and somatic anxiety is the physiological anxious responses. So that makes sense, right? Like if you're targeting an intervention at the cognition, it makes sense that it's going to have an impact on the cognitive aspects of the anxiety. And so by using self-talk, it can have an influence on emotional states and anxious states. And so this is where that direct approach, there's definitely some evidence for that helping some athletes. Motivational self-talk was linked to enhanced confidence, but positive self-talk was not similarly linked. So what this is talking about is that there was an association between using that motivational talk, like, come on, or you can do it, and having a positive impact on confidence. But just saying positive things didn't seem to impact that self-confidence. So as I said earlier, there's different types of self-talk, but in the literature, a lot of it is focused on the motivational versus instructional, because there's just really not a lot of research supporting the impact of either positive or negative self-talk. And so some of you might have heard a little bit of that controversy in psychology, where there can be such a thing as toxic positivity, where you just say positive things. The idea is that just saying something positive is not necessarily going to have a benefit on performance. And what we're talking about here with self-talk, it looks like a lot of the benefits of self-talk is when it's actually influencing behavior. So motivational, it's influencing effort, or instructional, it's influencing attention onto task-relevant cues. So just saying something positive as opposed to having a negative thought and then just replacing it with a positive one, based on the research, it's not showing that that's going to have a large impact on performance. So that's maybe something that you also might have come into the lecture thinking that, oh, if you just say something positive to yourself, that's always going to be beneficial. Well, maybe you might want to rethink about like what you're actually saying to yourself and what actual impact are those statements having. The final point, which is a little bit disappointing, unfortunately, but hopefully the research will continue to expand. But a lot of the research on self-talk has really been on novice individuals, or maybe athletes that are in a particular lab-based research study. So there hasn't been a lot of research really in the real competitive environments. So seeing whether this self-talk has a real impact on outcomes in a competitive environment, they haven't quite got there with the research because it's a little bit difficult to do, unfortunately. So a lot of the information we've got from self-talk is more on those kind of lab-based experiments. And so we can kind of generalize it to competitive environments, but we don't have that great quality of research in this area, unfortunately. So it still needs to be expanded. But I think that the key things to take away from this is that self-talk is beneficial for performance overall, particularly those fine motor skills performances, like the dart throwing, or even within more broader sports like AFL or NRL, when it really comes down to the goal kicking or those tasks that require that hand or foot-eye coordination. That's when self-talk seems to have the biggest impact. Now, as I have mentioned at the start of this lecture, we've got the CBT framework, which is more of that direct approach. And then I'll always try and provide an understanding of how more of that mindful ACT framework can be used for each of the components that we talk about. Now, I do just want to say that in general, when I think about self-talk, using like instructional or motivational self-talk, that's not going against the mindfulness approach. Both of those things bring your attention onto what matters and what's important in the moment. So even if you're just using your traditional types of self-talk, that can be quite useful. Probably the key difference as to how we would know that we're using more of a direct approach like CBT compared to ACT is if you spend any time directly challenging or trying to change thoughts. So with CBT, if someone has a negative thought, you might spend some time trying to change that into a positive thought or reframing that into a different type of thought. Whereas in ACT, you might allow that thought to be there, accept that you're having that negative thought and bring your attention back onto what matters in the moment. Maybe using your instructional or motivational self-talk. So that's really the key point, is that if you're changing or challenging or trying to get rid of thoughts, that's more of a CBT approach. Whereas if you're making room for and allowing whatever thoughts to come up, that's more of an ACT framework. So in ACT, the workability of thoughts and changing the relationship to thoughts is really important. So in CBT, you're changing the thought itself, whereas in ACT, you're changing your relationship to that thought. So our diffusion skills that we've talked about, the way that we would change our relationship to the thought is by really creating space from that. So noticing that it is just a thought, rather than necessarily having to determine whether it's true or not. You're just creating space and noticing it's just a thought and then bringing your attention onto what matters. So a really simple example for this diffusion skill is naming the thought. So if you're really commonly having this tendency to have some of those thoughts that I'm going to fail, you might name that as the not good enough story. So whenever that pops up, you might go, oh yeah, that's the not good enough story. And you see that as just a thought, and then you don't spend too much time trying to challenge it or change it or determine whether it's correct or incorrect. You simply just notice it, creating some distance from it by naming it, and then you kind of come back onto what matters. And what matters might be, okay, well, I really need to bring my attention onto the task right now. So that's where you might use one of those instructional cue words to get you focused back on the task. Similarly with ACT, it's about the workability. So as I've kind of mentioned, the use of traditional self-talk can be really useful if it merely just directs your attention onto what matters and helps you to be the athlete you want to be. So you could basically just use self-talk how it's used in the traditional way, because as long as it's directing you onto what matters in the moment, rather than you trying to get rid of negative self-talk or trying to fight with or struggle with it, then self-talk can become workable for you, and you're already using more of a mindful approach. So self-talk is another skill that can be quite an easy one to incorporate into that real mindful approach without really having to change too much. It's more of the diffusion side, where you would create some separation or change the relationship to the thought, versus the direct approach of actually changing the thought itself. That's the only area where the two really differ when it comes to self-talk. Okay, so now we will go into confidence and understanding confidence. So as we've talked about with self-talk, I've already mentioned that self-talk is more about thoughts. Whereas when we're thinking about confidence, you can think about this as more about emotions. So the technical definition for self-confidence is the perceived ability to accomplish a certain level of performance. And oftentimes, terms are used quite interchangeably in the literature, and it's probably not something that you need to worry too much about, but just highlighting for you that a similar concept of self-efficacy. It definitely relates strongly to self-confidence, but just remembering that self-efficacy is more situationally specific. So a performer might believe that they can execute a behaviour required to produce a certain outcome successfully in a specific situation. So someone might have high self-efficacy for, let's say they're an AFL player, they might have high self-efficacy for their ability to tackle, but they might have quite low self-efficacy for their ability to kick at goal on a set shot. So see how that's more of a very specific situation where they have self-efficacy in some situations and not so much in others. Whereas when we talk about self-confidence, it's more broad. So their perceived ability to accomplish that level of performance. So an example of this would be when an athlete says, I'm feeling confident and I'm going to be able to perform well today. So self-confidence is more broad. Self-efficacy, more situationally specific. Also highlighting here that confidence is indeed both a personality trait and a psychological state. So if you're having the thought that, well, it really seems like some athletes just naturally tend to be quite confident, you're probably right. That can be the case for some people, where they just naturally have that more confidence as a part of their personality trait. Whereas for some other athletes, they might be more prone to being a bit more anxious or having a bit more self-doubt. But because confidence is a psychological state and it's an emotion, someone with high personality traits around self-confidence can still feel low in confidence in certain situations. Maybe they've just lost a grand final, and maybe at that point they've grown quite low in confidence. Or the opposite can happen. Someone who's maybe prone to a bit more self-doubt, their confidence is most likely going to be up right after they've just performed really well, right? But the understanding is that it is an emotion. And so it's something that is likely to fluctuate, even across an individual game. If we're talking about AFL, you can start the game really confident, and then by the end of it, depending on what's going on, you might drop some confidence. So what I really want you to understand is that confidence is an emotion and it can fluctuate. Now, in the research with self-confidence, and I think this is one that you might be surprised about, overall, yes, confidence does have a positive effect on performance, but this effect was found to be small. So the researchers that actually did this meta-analysis, one of their concluding comments was that the relationship between confidence and performance is actually not as strong as the theories behind it predict, as well as what generally people might think. I think in general, a lot of people place a high and put a lot of emphasis on needing to feel confident before a performance in order to be able to perform well. And the research just doesn't seem to back that up. Yes, it can have a small effect, but there are a lot of other things that we've talked about so far that have a lot larger effect on performance. And one of the challenging aspects of confidence is that it's not always directly in our control as to how confident we feel, because it's an emotion, right? We can definitely use interventions to build that and influence it, but we don't always have complete control over that. So this is a really, really important point. And this is really useful to understand and explain to athletes or students, because it can be quite common that the athlete or student gets really caught up in the fact that they're not feeling confident. And that can actually really get the athlete or the student distracted by trying to change that confidence, rather than maybe focusing their energy on something that actually is going to have more of an impact. So, talking earlier about self-talk or instructional cues to direct their attention and some of the things that they have more control over can actually be more beneficial to spend your energy on. Now, the research on confidence actually highlights that there's a stronger relationship between confidence and performance, but actually sports that have a shorter duration versus longer duration. What they basically understood at this point to mean is that because confidence can fluctuate over the course of a 2-hour match, the confidence could actually be going up or down, depending on what's going on in the match, depending on how you're playing, depending on how your opponents are playing, depending on how your teammates are playing. So the longer the performance, the more likely that confidence is going to go up or go down. When we're thinking about confidence, Bandura is one of the main theories that we always come back to, because Bandura's studies on confidence and self-efficacy really form the foundation of a lot of our understanding of these concepts. And so if we're looking at this diagram here, what we can see is that self-confidence is influenced by a broad array of factors. And so some of the factors on the left, starting with performance accomplishments. So if you're thinking about an athlete in a sports context, the performance accomplishments they've had is likely to be a factor that influences confidence over time. However, as we've talked about, confidence is also an emotional state. So even if you had performance accomplishments throughout your career, that doesn't mean that you're always going to be feeling confident in the moment, particularly in a match maybe where you're, for whatever reason, not performing at your best. That confidence can be prone to shifting quite rapidly. Vicarious experience. So vicarious means experiencing life, emotions, or actions indirectly through the experience of others, rather than firsthand. So if you're thinking about a situation where you're in a team, you can also take on the confidence of other teammates and how they're performing, and that can influence confidence. Verbal persuasion, so how we talk to ourselves and how others talk to us can influence confidence. And physiological states. So if you think about heightened anxiety, that can be a factor that for some people could be perceived as something that could actually negatively impact their confidence because they're feeling quite anxious and they're feeling those physiological states of anxiety. Whereas someone else might also interpret those states as excitability or readiness to perform. So when we're thinking about confidence, lots of different factors can influence how confident someone feels. But it's also about their own internal factors as well that can influence whether they're feeling quite confident or not confident, depending on the interpretation. And so really what I want you to understand from this idea is that even if someone is influenced to feel confident in a certain way, you still have choice over your behaviours. So even if you're not feeling confident, you can still choose to put effort and persistence into a certain activity. And that overrides or is more important than the feeling of confidence in terms of the success in actually getting the outcome that you want. So effort, persistence, and choosing helpful behaviours, they actually tend to be what brings out the overall results, as opposed to whether or not you feel confident. So when we're thinking about the thought patterns as well, whether or not you're confident, you could still be engaged in goal-orientated behaviours, and whether or not worry is there, you could still dedicate your efforts into what matters in the moment. So here is another example of different factors that influence sport confidence. So your physical and mental preparation, your social support you have around you, the coach leadership, the environmental support, and situational favourableness. So a lot of these are interpretations that the individual can have about a certain experience and whether or not they'll feel confident. And so there's a lot of factors that can go into whether or not someone feels confident. But as we're kind of talking about, there are also a lot of variability between how one person might perceive a situation and whether they feel confident or not so confident. And so relying on confidence as a means as to whether or not you're going to be successful, it can kind of put you onto shaky ground because you're not necessarily always going to be feeling confident, and you're not necessarily even going to feel confident even if some of these factors are present because of the nature of your personality trait, for example, or just the nature on the day or other factors that are going to influence your confidence. So even though we can be aware of some of the things that influence our confidence, it's important to recognize that a lot of these things can be quite out of our control as well. So one of the ways of looking at confidence is kind of approaching it through the lens of competence being most important as opposed to confidence. So athletes or coaches often believe that thoughts and feelings are the basis for good performance. So the idea that I need to feel or think a certain way to perform well. And so if we stick with this idea, performance can be very susceptible to influence. So this is kind of, I guess, a little bit of a criticism of that CBT approach, where what you think and feel influences your actions. Even though it's a good theory in general, it can fall down in some areas just because of the fact that you don't always have complete control over those things. There are going to be times where thoughts and feelings come up that you don't like. And does that mean that your performance is going to just fall completely by the wayside? So having confidence as your foundation, it can really put you onto shaky ground. Whereas instead, if we build the success of your actions, so we build a good foundation of competence. So some of the blocks of competence is good preparation, having those skills and those interventions that we've talked about previously as some of our basis. So when you think about using evidence-based strategy, so things such as using your keywords, using your pressure testing in different training environments to build confidence, putting the hard work in at training to build that confidence, to build that skill development. So really building that confidence from those actions, those things that you have control over, is a much firmer foundation to build off of as opposed to building off of confidence. And what we tend to find is that we really put our energy into those things that matter, the things that we do have control over, getting ourselves as prepared as possible. What you'll find is that the person does tend to actually feel more confident on the day anyway. But if we completely rely on whether or not we're feeling confident and we spend our energy on that rather than building more of a solid block of building that confidence, then it does put us in a bit of a shaky territory. To apply how the confidence aspects relates from the mindfulness or ACT-based perspective, I want you to think for yourself. What maybe or where has confidence maybe got in the way? So what have you missed out on? Or what have you given up on because you thought you didn't have enough confidence? We're going to just take a moment here to think about that for yourself. So when we think about confidence, particularly in sport, it's really important that we understand that it's actually for a purpose. So when we think about why we want confidence, think about the idea that if you continue to go through this same old daily routine, doing the same old things, and you walked and talked exactly the same as before, you don't start a new project, you don't pursue any new goals, your performance doesn't alter in any way, your character doesn't change, you don't treat yourself or any other people differently, you behave in exactly the same way as you did before, and the only thing different is that you now felt confident. Would you be satisfied with that outcome? I would suggest most people wouldn't. So the idea is that we want to have confidence for a reason. We have a purpose behind confidence. And as we've discussed earlier, a lot of people have that idea that we need confidence to be able to improve performance. So one of the ways that we can actually access this from more of an ACT approach is to actually consider what it is you think confidence would help you do. So what sort of person would you be? And what are the sort of things you would do? Let's use a swimmer as an example. How would you walk into the swimming pool if you were to feel confident? What would that look like? How would I know that you're feeling confident? How would you behave? What would you be saying? What are the things you would stop doing? Maybe if you were feeling confident, you wouldn't be spending so much time trying to change how you felt. Maybe you would be more likely to be focused on the task, focused on what you needed to do in the moment. So when we think about what confidence would actually help you do, you can actually begin to open up the door to really what we're looking at in terms of values and behaviours and the kind of athlete that actually is confident. You could even ask an athlete or a student, could you behave in that way, even if you didn't feel that confidence there? Could you still engage in all of those things? Do you need confidence to be able to stand up tall with your shoulders back? Do you need confidence to be able to commit to what matters in the moment and bring your attention onto what matters? And the thing is, confidence definitely makes it easier to do those things. It feels harder to do those things when we're not feeling confident, but can we do it? We actually can. And so that's the real difference of the ACT perspective, is rather than focusing on trying to change the feeling, we typically focus on moving towards the actions that are important and that are workable and that are going to help us with our performance. And what you typically find is that confidence actually comes from the actions anyway. And when you're actually doing all of those things, when you're actually committing to what matters, when you're really clear on what's important, the feeling tends to come after the fact anyway. So the key point that I want to make here is, do you need to wait for that feeling to be there? Or can you commit to those helpful actions regardless? Can you do what matters? Can you come back into the present and focus on what's important? And allow that confident feeling to follow. So I don't want to diminish the idea of confidence and the fact that people really want to have that. Of course, that makes things feel easier, that makes things very enjoyable, and it can have an effect on performance. Yet, albeit being small, it does have an effect on performance. So the idea is that it's not about making room for whatever feelings to be there, because we're saying it doesn't matter and we're diminishing that. What we're basically saying is that the more you make room for feelings to come and go, and the more you focus on what matters, and the more you commit to those things that are important in the moment, that's actually the way that you're more likely to build confidence anyways. So rather than trying to directly control that feeling, it's really coming back to what's important. And so what I've highlighted here is some of those key factors, like moving towards your values, letting your thoughts come and go, so that diffusion aspect, and making room for emotions. Whatever emotions come where there's a bit of anxiety or a bit of self-doubt. Those can come and they can go. And then you might have some feelings of confidence come at different times as well. But regardless of what's there, can you come back to focusing on what's important in the moment? And you can really use some of those skills that we've learned in the previous lectures and earlier in the lecture around self-talk to actually build that ability to come back onto what matters. So the motivational and instructional self-talk to bring you back to putting effort into what you're doing, focusing your attention on the technical cues of what you need to do in the moment. So all of those things can work together, but really what I want you to take on board is that where you spend your energy matters. And you can spend your energy building things like I talked about earlier around competence and moving towards what's actually going to help you with performance, rather than getting too caught up in what you are or are not feeling on the day. So this is a really helpful question to ask any of your athletes or students when they come up to you and maybe ask you about, I'm not feeling confident. Can you help me feel more confident? The question you can ask them is, what would you be doing if you did have more confidence? And that can really open the door to moving them in a direction of doing those things anyway, whether or not the confidence is actually there. And that can be a really powerful way to really mindfully come back into the moment and do what matters, which is really something I'm repeating quite a lot because it's those core skills of being present, doing what matters, allowing thoughts and feelings to be there. They're actually optimizing performance based on the research, and rather than chasing feelings of whether or not we want anxiety or whether or not we want to feel more confident, it's about investing your energy where you're most likely to get the results you're really seeking. So that brings us to the end of the lecture for this week. I really hope you got something out of today, and I know that there are 2 different concepts that we've covered here, and they did interweave quite a bit, but it's really important that you take an approach that works for you. And even though I might highlight more indirectly or more of the mindfulness approach, if you really feel like more of that direct CBT approach to self-talk and confidence works for you, then absolutely go for it. It's really about the individual practitioner, and I'm just presenting the current research available and the current state of what sports psychology is. And so, hopefully after this lecture, you can kind of think about how you might apply some of these skills for yourself, as well as for the students or athletes that you might be working with going forward.